Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Comics Lair. This discussion will travel across the cosmos with Thor Odinson. The Comics Lair is sponsored by Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and Heroes Convention. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott, and we'll start with the panelists introducing themselves, telling us a little bit about how they got into comics and a little bit about themselves. Clay, will you start?
Yeah, hi, I'm Clay Griffith. You may know me as part of Clay and Susan Griffith. We write fantasy, historical fantasy. We've done some superhero tie-in stuff, and we used to write comics many years ago. I'm a comics guy from the 1960s up, and Thor was one of my guys. I was a Marvel kid, and Thor was one of my top. Not the top two, that was Spidey and FF, but he was right below those guys. So, yeah, I've been a Thor guy for a long time.
Bobby?
Hi, I'm Bobby Nash. I write novels, comics, etc., etc. I got into Thor in the 80s, around the Walt Simonson era, and fell in love with the character and the world, and then went back and rediscovered some of the older Thors up, with the Kirby stuff, the Lee stuff, up to John Buscema and all those. And I think I might have read one or two. Actually, I know I'd read one or two as a kid. I do remember the very first one I read was the one where I forget the issue number, but Loki tricks this blind guy into shooting Balder with an arrow, and it kills him, and then Ragnarok is going to start. And then it took 20 years before I found out what happened next. But yeah, I'm a big Thor fan from at least the 80s, and so love and excited to talk about him.
Mike?
I'm Mike Davenport. I am the creative director of the Marvel Universe Online project, and I'm a big Thor fan from the 80s, Walt Simonson period. Before then, I was a big fan of mythology in general. So the Thor mythology as a kid, tied me back to that. So I would read stuff in Thor, and I would find it interesting how the comic version of Thor differed from the mythology version of Thor, which it made me go back and look up more about, Norse mythology to begin with, because growing up, I really didn't know that much about it. So it was really fascinating. And, back in the day, there was I think Thor had a closer tie to the mythology, especially Simonson's era, did a lot to connect to the actual Norse mythology back then. And that's when I really got super interested in it. And so, yeah, I'm a huge Thor fan.
And we have our hammer. So Michael and I are ready.
We have our hammers.
Michael and I are ready to go.
I'm hammerless.
Many villains crash through will depend on you to take care of it.
Right. That's right.
I grew up mostly reading DC, and I was in my early 20s when a friend said, "You really should read Thor." And it was interesting to me what Mike said about mythology, because there were these children's books that I just loved when I was in grade school. The Lair's Greek myths were beautifully done picture books about the Greek gods, and they also did a Norse one, which I don't think quite got as much traction as the other one, but I loved it. And so the first time I picked up a Thor comic book, I went, but Thor has black hair and Sif is blonde, because they did in my book when I was 8 years old. And so somehow that had carried through with me into my 20s. But I kind of got past that. And at that point, Thor was Dr. Donald Blake, the physician who used a cane. And Jane Foster, who has now apparently been retconned into having been a doctor at that point, was a nurse. And he was not supposed to be in love with her because Odin said he couldn't. And so I sort of remember that. And the first story I actually remember reading was one where Jane Foster was dying, and Sif loved Thor so much that she gave Jane Foster her life essence so that Jane Foster could live. And that lasted, I think, about a year before they decided to separate Sif from Jane Foster. And lo and behold, Jane Foster had a fiance all this time. Who knew? And so they had a big happy reunion in the hospital, and that was kind of the end of that. So I read Thor through the Beta Ray Bill stage and a little bit after that. And of course, I've enjoyed it in the movie. So I'm not quite the educated Thor fan that some of the panel are. So we'll let them.
And now, as a DC fan, because Thor is not someone. I mean, is a public domain character,
right,
so to speak. There is a DC version of Thor.
Yes.
It's obviously a very different than the Marvel. There's other publishing companies have done versions of Thor as well, based on the myth.
Well, I was totally unaware of that, so I have something tonight. I have to go back and look at it.
Mm.
So, when you think about Thor, do you prefer Thor with the secret identity of Dr. Donald Blake, or do you prefer Thor, the outright demigod that we have in the movies and in the Avengers comics and some other sources? Bobby, what about you?
I kind of prefer him without the secret identity. I think, the secret identity can be fun, but I really, as cool as Thor fighting supervillains on Earth is, I prefer Thor when he's out either in Asgard with some problem, or on another planet, or out in the cosmos, or doing something out big, something.
Mm-hmm.
Because, we've already got 100 other Marvel characters running around fighting supervillains, giving Thor something else to do. And I thought that was one of the more interesting things that Simonson did was in his run. One of the very first things he did was get rid of the Donald Blake persona, which I know has come back and gone away a few times since then. But I think it opened up Thor to having bigger adventures than just Jane getting kidnapped and him having to rescue her, which the Lee Kirby stuff did a lot in the early days. So I kind of like it when Thor and other Asgardians are out having these huge adventures out in the cosmos.
Mike?
I think it's all about scale. Thor, when Thor shows up in an ensemble book, you automatically know that the scale's been elevated. So yeah, you're right that the secret identity kind of lost its point really quick. When you consider that a problem of Thor's level is usually going to require him to not he's not walking around waiting for a Thor level problem to happen on Earth. It's usually it's happening out there in the cosmos. Plus, I like the idea that Thor's walking around and talking around. He's been in existence for a couple of thousand years, and he's he's making theologians blow their brains out. Their heads explode trying to figure out what's this guy's deal. He keeps saying he's a god, but that shouldn't be possible. So I like him being out there. I like people asking questions about his origin and secret identity. Like you said, it ran its course, and I don't think it's necessary. It served a purpose to be fun back in the day, but now it's run its course.
Clay?
Yeah, I basically agree. I prefer Thor to Thor being an alternate version of Dr. Blake. It was okay early on, like Mike said. It not only ran its course, but it became sort of illogical, because when you found out that Thor existed and Asgard existed and all these other beings existed, why was this, and Thor didn't come about until Blake found the hammer and banged it. And so, but they explained it all eventually and did it very well. On the other hand, there are elements to Thor on Earth I kind of like, which also made Dr. Blake sort of illogical, because I loved some of the early Kirby Lee stuff when Thor was kind of a fish out of water on Earth, and he would go into a malt shop and that kind of all goofy stuff, and he would meet hippies on the street and talk to them. If you were really Donald Blake, you would know that stuff and wouldn't be stunned by Earth, habits. But they wanted him to be alien. So it was, again, Donald Blake sort of became illogical. And the concept of him, you're separated from your hammer for more than, what was it, a minute?
60 seconds, yeah.
Yeah, you became Donald Blake again. Nothing personal, nothing insulting, but that's kind of a DC kind of thing to me. And that.
Yeah.
So,
and those early days, too, they were very, I don't know if Lee and Kirby had a plan going in, because, in the very beginning, he wasn't Thor. He just had Thor's powers.
Yeah.
Then they decided, no, he really is Thor.
Yeah.
And it just kind of, so it took them a while, I think, to find their rhythm, find what they wanted to do with the
That's
with
very
the story.
true. And I think it was Kirby that drove it. Kirby
think so.
had always wanted to tell those big stories. Remember, I mean, you guys remember the old Tales of Asgard book.
Yes.
That Thor wasn't necessarily a part of, but he retold or re-envisioned the mythology. And he just wanted to build that world the same way he built, the New Gods world in DC and the Eternals and stuff when he came back to Marvel.
Yeah, and I think that's about when they started bringing Asgard into it. I think is when they started going to no, he doesn't have Thor's power. He is Thor.
Yeah. And keep in mind, too,
I agree. I think it was Kirby that probably pushed a lot of that in that direction.
And keep in mind too, the target audience changed a lot too. You could be satisfied with telling simple stories back in the day too with Thor. So a lot of explanation, a lot of background story of Asgard really wasn't necessary back in the day too, like in the early 70s or so. You could tell simpler stories, but then as the target audience began to mature, it forced writers to expand that world, fans started wanting to see more of Thor's background, hence Tales of Asgard and whatnot. So it became necessary to delve in there a lot deeper.
Kirby built
about Asgard.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, what were you going to say, Clay?
I was going to say Kirby built big chunks of the Marvel universe in Thor. Like Galactus's origin appears in Thor.
In Thor, yes.
It doesn't appear in Fantastic Four.
Yes.
So,
It's also too. I mean, part of the reason you were talking about the audience and the sophistication, the audience growing in the late '60s and early '70s. Marvel, especially, was a huge hit on college campuses.
Yeah,
and a lot of the storytelling started reflecting. We're not just writing for kids anymore. We're writing for this audience, and I think a lot of that really comes through in things. Certainly in Thor, and I think the Fantastic Four. And Spider-Man probably
and Doctor Strange.
Yeah. There was that very just stream of consciousness, more out there thinking.
Well, let's talk about Asgard for a minute. How do you think Asgard made its transition to the big screen? How do you think the Asgard of the movies compares to what you consider, and please tell us what that is, the best of the Asgard of the comic? Mike?
Well, I'll be the first to admit I wasn't quite on board with the whole magic is a different form of science kind of deal. I liked the comics interpretation that leaned heavily on the mythology. So you had a lot of that Norse style in the architecture in the comic version of Asgard. The Rainbow Bridge, the Bifrost was an actual, it was a non-descriptive rainbow bridge, and I liked that. I liked the idea of Heimdall standing on the bridge like a lone sentinel, and I understand what they did in the movie, and I learned to eventually appreciate that version of Asgard, and it's beautifully done. There are a lot of smart people that went into interpreting that into something that's more sensible for folks not like us who understand, have a deep comic background to be able to visualize what the concept of what Asgard is. So I like I said, I had to grow into it.
Okay. Clay?
I haven't yet grown into it. It's okay. I love the Thor movies. Well, I like the first one, not crazy about the second one. Love Ragnarok, not crazy about the next one. But anyway, I thought Kirby's version of Asgard is my Asgard because I was a kid. It's very not Norse. It's Kirby. It's Simonson's Asgard is much more Norse.
Norse, yeah.
But the movie Asgard just never appealed to me. It didn't wow me. When you go to Asgard, I wanted it to be a whole nother level of the Marvel universe, and just for me, it just wasn't. And even in the third movie, when it got blowed up real good, it didn't really mean anything to me. It never established itself in my heart. Love Thor, love Loki, the whole gang, but Asgard, not so much.
Okay. Bobby?
Yeah, there are a few places there are a few moments in the movies where I do go, okay, they looked at a Kirby drawing for this, but translating Kirby is not easy. Jack Kirby saw the world with a unique vision that he translated things, like a building, how anybody else would draw a building is not how Jack Kirby drew a building. You knew it was a building. It was still a gorgeous building, but it was uniquely Kirby. And there are a few moments where in the movies where I see that and I go, okay, I know what they're doing. I know what they're going for. I know what they're aiming for. But there's a lot of stuff that, especially from Thor, that is hard to translate. It wasn't the one that worried me wasn't the architecture. It was the Thor spinning the hammer and using the spinning hammer. Is that going to look silly on film? And I'm happy to say it's not. Like in the opening of the first movie, where he's spinning the hammer and like using it to like throw ice chunks and flying. They translated it well, but those were the things I was worried about because that stuff could, if they don't do it well, look silly.
Yeah, very true. I think part of the problem with translating, Kirby or anyone, but particularly Kirby, he never drew Asgard the same.
No.
From issue to issue. It looked totally different. There was not even a central landmark that you could say, oh, there's Kirby's throne room or there's Kirby's whatever. He drew it. It's like Asgard fell apart every night and grew up every morning looking totally different. Just like Odin's outfits. Odin, man, that guy knew how to dress.
When he had an eye patch. When he didn't have an eye patch.
Yes.
He knew
how the ornate helmets that just went out to everywhere.
You ain't kidding. You think you got a hat? That guy's got a hat.
That guy's got a hat.
Well, then let's talk about the inhabitants of Asgard for a minute. Who's your favorite and why? And who would you like to see get more time than they do if that's not the same character? Clay, will you start?
Well, I assume we'll talk about villains later, so I won't mention
We are going to talk about villains.
Okay. Oddly enough, my favorite was probably Hogan the Grim, mainly because he just rarely did anything, but he was so cool. He was like that guy who was standing in the back. You were always waiting for him to do something because you knew it was going to be great. And he would get involved in fights and stuff. Of course, Volstagg is fun. But man, Hogan, there's just something about him and the mace and the dark armor. He was awesome. He, again, didn't translate to the movie. They kind of wasted those guys.
Yeah, unfortunately. Literally wasted.
Bobby?
I do agree. Volstagg is a lot of fun, but for me, I always had a soft spot for Balder, which we have not had in the movies as yet. And excuse me, because Balder it's Balder the Brave. He is this legendary Asgardian warrior who, I forget the exact details of it, but supposedly no weapon can kill him. And he's like, and later I think we find out he's actually a son of Odin. Yes. But I think we find that out later in the comics. Yes. But I always thought he was like Thor's best friend. He was Thor's, his buddy. They did a lot of adventures together. And I always just thought Balder was really cool. And certainly the Simonson era where Balder actually ends up becoming the ruler of Asgard for a time. After one of Odin's many deaths. That's he's probably died more in Marvel than anybody, I think.
Yeah.
So just a cool character that and he was also central to the very first Thor book I ever read. So I think that kind of helped kind of cement him in my brain.
Okay, Mike?
Yeah, I like Balder too, but I feel for Sif. I feel for Sif because it always felt like they couldn't quite find a niche for her. Like you felt like Sif was this. I understood she's a great warrior and everything, but she felt like you wanted to make a Valkyrie, but she wasn't a Valkyrie. And I thought she had a lot more. I thought she deserved a lot more depth than that.
Mhm.
You know, I thought she deserved a lot more depth than being a love interest of Thor. You know, I believe that that no one's ever really delved into this dynamic of hers. You know, where she could actually stand out between. She kind of felt like she was wedged between Thor and the Warriors 3.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're the standout characters when they're together, and Thor's a standout character, and she's always somewhere in between. She is the Warriors 3 and Lady Sif.
Well, do you think that's a function of the general roles that were assigned to women in the comic books in the late 60s and early 70s?
It was.
Sure.
It was. And I really wanted to see, now we're in a modern area. I really wanted to see more from Lady Sif, and unfortunately, the movies didn't do much to help that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and a lot of it, I mean, especially, Lee and Kirby, for all, for as good as their stuff was, the women in their stories tended to be the girlfriend, the damsel in distress.
Yep.
They were either in danger, they were doing something silly, or they were pining over something.
They were pining constantly. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be the default. I mean, even Sue Storm in the Fantastic Four, who is supposedly an equal part of the team, did not always feel like an equal part of the team.
No, they never let them develop their powers, which later writers would do. I remember in an early X-Men, Jean Grey's contribution to the fight was to use her telekinesis to flip Magneto's cape over his head. And so he couldn't see.
There was an issue of Justice League when I was growing up. I guess I was in high school, and there was a big battle, and Flash was running back to the battle, and Wonder Woman and Black Canary were there, and he said, "You stay here and tend to the wounded while I go fight." In
the Justice Society, Wonder Woman was also their secretary.
Yeah, their secretary.
Yeah. So Sif was my favorite of the Asgardian characters, not because of what she was, but because of what I thought she could be.
Yeah.
And also, when I started reading comics, it was that dynamic we've just been talking about. And I really gravitated toward female characters that I thought had the potential to do more, whether they were doing it or not. The few who really did were Rita Farr in the Doom Patrol, Silver Age Doom Patrol when she was not a blob. Saturn Girl in the Legion of Superheroes.
Yeah.
Sometimes Lois Lane, sometimes not. There were all those I have to find Superman's secret identity so he'll have to marry me nauseating stories. But those were in there. And then Wonder Woman when she wasn't having to be saved by Steve Trevor. So it was a mixed bag. And I looked at Sif and I thought she did that sacrificial thing for Jane Foster. And I thought that took a really big heart and a lot of nerve to do that. So
and Thor didn't seem to care.
No, he didn't seem to care. He didn't seem to appreciate it. But in the movies, my favorite Asgardian character is Tessa Thompson's Valkyrie. So, yeah. So why don't we go ahead and talk about villains? Because this seems as good a place as any. Because I do want to do a lot of talk about the whole Thor Jane Foster thing, but I'm thinking let's save that to toward the end. So who's your favorite Thor villain? And I think, Clay, we're back to starting with you.
All right. My favorite Thor villain is the Mangog. I love the Mangog, mainly for his first appearance. Later, he got used over and over again, and he was boring. The first 3 or 4 issue epic where the Mangog wakes up and marches to Asgard while the armies of Asgard go out to meet him, and they're getting slaughtered and coming back broken and wounded. And of course, Odin is in his Odin sleep. And Mangog's coming to draw the Odin sword. I guess they just name everything Odin.
Yeah, something.
Hyphen noun in Asgard. But Mangog comes in and everyone's fighting. And the coolest thing about it was, other than Mangog just being awesome, it shows the characters. Thor is willing to die. He'll die protecting Asgard. Loki, because Odin is snoozing, Loki takes the throne. and he's reveling in being in charge, but he's in charge of an apocalypse, and all his advisors are saying, "You got to do something about the Mangog. There's no way to stop him." And Loki's just like, "Oh, I'm finally the king, and that was my goal, and I've reached my goal. So don't give me any bad news."
Mhm.
And it's brilliant. It's brilliant, and it ends up kind of it's a bad conclusion to the greatest of all stories, but Mangog, can't say enough.
Bobby?
There are two that I didn't realize when I first saw them were Thor villains, because I saw them at first in an Avengers issue, but Surtur and Ymir, the gods of fire and ice. Yeah. There's a great Avengers issue that Thor's oddly enough not in. That where it's there's the first 2 pages are big splash pages.
Oh, I know the one you're talking about. Yeah,
one's got Ymir, and it's like, some say the world will end in fire.
I remember that one too. Yeah,
and there was just the coolness of those 2 characters, of how they looked, and they're massive, and then I thought, certainly Walt Simonson got a lot of use out of Surtur in his run. I don't think he ever really did much with Ymir, but those 2 characters, just by the sheer presence and size and just monstrousness, those were not characters that anybody else should be dealing with, which is oddly enough because it was the Avengers that were dealing with them first. And it wasn't even like the A-list Avengers. It was Hawkeye and the Black Knight, Doctor Strange, and the Vision. Right. But just those guys, they're just from how they looked and all that, I thought, these are not guys. Spider-Man shouldn't be dealing with these guys.
Yeah.
This is something that needs Thor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mike?
Ulik the rock troll.
Yeah.
Imagine being told that you are the Thor of the trolls, of the rock trolls. And then every time you try to fulfill that destiny, you get your ass beat. But you're the strongest troll there is. I love that guy. I love his persistence. I love this absolute confidence in his own superiority when clearly he's not. And I love the design of character. I love the rock troll. I love his rock troll gauntlets.
Yeah.
They're just the best.
And another one of those characters that they're not a human character. It's not a human in the suit. This guy looks alien. He is not, and I think that's the brilliance of a Jack Kirby design is he does things that he would design characters in a way that almost wouldn't work in the real world. It would be so out of place.
Ulik freed the Mangog originally.
Yes.
Just out of spite. It's like, this is where the Mangog is. I'm going to bust this guy out and show Asgard. And of course, Mangog stomps him and walks on. And he looks like, oh, thanks, jerk.
Right.
Well, there's one Thor antagonist that may have gotten a disproportionate amount of screen time, depending on your opinion of it. And of course, that's Loki. What do you think of the dynamic of Thor and Loki? You can work in comics, movies, whatever works for you and makes your point. Bobby?
I love the Loki in the movies. He's not the Loki I grew up with. When I think of Loki, my first thought is not this handsome rogue that we got in the movies. My thought is how John Buscema would draw Loki.
Oh, yeah.
Like laying back like this in his throne. Me turned over going, I'm bored. He's looking, he was just miserable. Just, you looked at him and you didn't have to know he was a bad guy. He looked evil. Yeah. And it was just the way they drew him. And when I think of Loki, that's usually the first kind of inkling of who he is to me. I think the movies have done a good job with Loki, but it's a different Loki. But I do love in the movies, I do love the relationship between them. and I think the comics kind of do this too, where as bad as Thor knows Loki is, he still loves him because he's his brother. Even though Loki's like, I'm going to kill you. Great. So, yeah. I love that relationship.
Okay. Mike?
I appreciate Loki in the movies, but personally, I like him better when he's not, Loki's been made to be this handsome rogue kind of character nowadays. And he doesn't, especially now he's on his redemption arc in the TV show. I feel like we lost a villain, a pure villain, through this redemption arc. So when we redesigned him for the project, I specifically wanted him to have a touch of the appearance of him in the movie with the long dark hair, but I wanted him to look like I told the artist, I said, I want him to look like a hater. I want him to have a snarl about him that, you couldn't find you couldn't look through the snarl in his look to find something appealing. He just looked like everything he looks at, everything happy, he just hates. And that's what I liked about Loki. Loki, at any given moment, Loki looked like he hated all of this. He always had this look like he was tired of being here. I'm tired of your crap. I'm tired of your crap. I'm just tired of being here. And I'm going to do something about it. And it's going to be funny to me. I'm going to do something horrible to all of you. And it's going to be funny to me. Because, of course, I am the god of trick. I'm the trickster god. It's going to be hilarious. And it's going to cause a whole lot of people to die. He's kind of like Asgard, the Asgardian Joker, He's the Asgardian Joker. He does, his quote unquote tricks are horrible. But, he's the kind of guy who's, he's not happy unless everyone around him is miserable. So that's the character I like.
Okay, Clay?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree again. I like the movie Loki, but he's a different character,
yes.
or becomes a different character. Yeah. He's similar in the first movie. A little emo, but he's okay. Kirby's Loki is good, and it's kind of the one I think of. But Kirby had a tendency to want to resolve the Loki Thor dynamic with fistfights, and Loki's not that guy, or shouldn't be. No. Simonson's Loki is, to me, the purest, because he is the trickster. He's thinking, he's trying to outsmart you. He knows he's not going to fist fight with Thor. That's the dumbest thing ever. But he's got a plan, and he's a couple of steps ahead or behind. And that's the Loki I really like as a character, is that Simonson version to me.
Yeah, he was a conniver.
Yes.
Yes.
He was brilliant. And he would bring other people into his schemes, and he'd get rid of them when he didn't need them anymore. And I loved that. Was great. Simonson was great at that.
I liked the way they wrote the dynamic between Thor and Loki in the movies. And it really demonstrated, I think, how complex their relationship was. It's the sort of love-hate relationship, because sometimes Loki's on Thor's side and sometimes you only think he's on Thor's side. And so it keeps things interesting that way. But I sort of found myself wishing, could we have a villain who's not Loki? A big bad who's not Loki? And they did a little bit of that, but I just thought the Marvel universe is so big and so complex, and I just would have liked to see a little bit more of it in the movies.
Because there's a lot of Thor characters they have not touched in those movies.
Yeah. And I say that as somebody who hasn't read it in a long time, but I just remember that it had a big cast of characters. Although I will say I really liked Idris Elba as Heimdall. I thought he was great in that role.
Yeah.
So what is your favorite story arc? Mike?
Definitely Ragnarok. For me as a kid, the scenes with the Midgard serpent, Simonson's Midgard serpent, just stand out to me. It was like that, and Fafnir when Fafnir died, and he put Fafnir the dragon on the pyre, and there was it was scenes for me that made it for me. It was a huge spectacle, and I love it when Thor does spectacles, because especially Walt Simonson's run, he did some of the greatest spectacles, battles, ever. That's what it was for me. I think, yeah.
Okay, Clay.
My favorite Thor story. Oh, Mangog. I thought I'd mention Mangog again because you can't have too much Mangog in an hour. But yeah, other than Mangog, some of Simonson's stuff is fantastic. The frog story is great.
Yes.
It's just this weird little thing that comes out of nowhere. And those moments, as Mike was talking about, the death of the executioner, when he's got and they did that in the movie, but it didn't have the same.
No, the same weight to it. Yeah.
Oh, the narration that Simonson wrote as he's blasting away with that's fantastic stuff. It's very moving. It's surprisingly moving for a long-term character like Executioner, but in essence a throwaway character.
A throwaway character. Yeah.
He was never anything until that moment.
Right.
Yeah. And then he was everybody's favorite, mine included. I mean, he's no Mangog, but it's okay.
But who is?
No one.
Okay, Bobby, you want to follow that?
It's tough. There's a lot of the Simonson run I really love. There's the Surtur attacking Asgard that led up to the big 350th.
Yeah.
That's an amazing story that runs quite a number of issues. I love the old Tales of Asgard stuff. I'm surprised no one at Disney Marvel has said, you know what, that's our Game of Thrones right there.
Yeah.
Tales of Asgard.
Yeah.
I mean, think of what you could do with that, There's also near the end of I know we're hyping on the Simonson run, but there's right near the end of his run, there is an issue that is told in all splash pages of Thor fighting the Midgard serpent. That is just absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
One powerful image after another.
After the next. Yep.
Yeah. And that was a lot of fun. But I also enjoyed the run, not quite as much on the writing side, but the art side after Simonson left. Ron Friends and Brett Breeding, and then Ron Friends and Joe Sinnott were handling the art chores, and they were doing a very Kirby-esque.
Yeah, good old fashioned.
Yeah. And so that was a lot of fun. Because one of the things when I think of Thor, the Thor comics, one of the things to me is Thor comics had the coolest covers.
Yeah, they did.
Almost universally, no matter who was on them. They seemed to have some of the coolest covers ever. And that kind of feel just kept going. And so those are the ones that really stand out to me.
Okay. Well, talking of standouts, what's your favorite Thor appearance in the Marvel Cinematic Universe? It can be one of his movies. It can be one of the Avengers movies. Whatever you want to pick. I've lost my place, so Bobby, we're going to start with you.
Okay. Well, I mean, as cool as his entrance into Wakanda is in Infinity War, which is an amazing. I mean, I remember the theater going nuts when he shows up in the middle of that battle. There is a scene earlier in that movie where he is talking with Rocket about his whole journey through that movie. He's talking with Rocket about, he's lost everything. And, we've got to go fix the hammer. We need a hammer. And he's willing to die. And that scene where he's pulling open the blast doors.
Yeah.
Yes. That scene, that to me, that is the most Thor he is in all of the cinematic universe, is him doing that. And that's when it got me right. Like, it got me right there. So.
Okay. Bobby?
Well, that was me.
I'm sorry, you are Bobby. I'm sorry, it's Monday. Mike, what about you?
All right, I'm gonna blow all you guys' minds here. The Adventures in Babysitting.
I thought you were going to go Hulk TV movie. Sorry.
Adventures in Babysitting. That stuck with me so much because it was so unexpected. When Vincent D'Onofrio comes down, he's got the hat on, he's got the sheath, he's blonde. I'm like, are you kidding me? That was it's such a short scene, but it's so touching. It stuck with me ever since the first time I saw it as a teenager. That was a Thor moment that was like, I felt like Thor could exist outside. That's when I felt Thor could exist outside of the comics and be really cool. I was like, man, that was the first time I thought, a Thor movie would be really cool.
Okay, Clay.
Well, there's a lot of them, but the one that I remember all the time, because sometimes when you're writing, the best way to have an impact of a character is for other people to view him rather than for him or her to do something. And there's the scene, I can't remember what movie it's in off the top of my head, where he's been brought into the ship of the Guardians of the Galaxy and he's unconscious. And Star-Lord says, wow, this dude's still alive. And Drax says, no, you're a dude. This is a man.
Yeah.
And it's brilliant. It's a brilliant little moment. It's like, oh yeah, he's a different thing than these other people.
Yes.
And we shouldn't forget it because he does a lot of comedy now.
Right.
He's a different entity than these other people.
Yeah, I think that kind of really stands out too. Like when he shows up in Wakanda, I mean, they're pretty much getting their asses kicked.
Yes.
When he shows up and turns the tide, at least for a few minutes. Mm-hmm. And because at that moment, it really becomes a Thor movie because right up until the end, it's Thor versus Thanos. And when he's full of, because earlier in that movie, we had seen him so full of doubts and all this stuff that when he shows up here, he's full of bluster, that bring me Thanos, he's trying to be that guy again. And I thought, I know a lot of people don't like the fat Thor we get later, but I found that whole arc to be pretty interesting that, he lost everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
And how does that impact people? And the fact that they were able to bring him back from it.
Yeah.
Even though they did it in kind of a silly way.
Yeah, I liked that arc too. Of the movies as a whole, my favorite's the first one. Yeah. Because it was a Jane Foster I could like. I loved the beginning when he really didn't know who he was and he was trying to get Mjolnir back. And then it was a nice introduction for Hawkeye too. And the Warriors 3 had a nice bit. And that thing in the town when I forget, what's its name? That big
Destroyer.
Oh, the Destroyer.
Destroyer.
Yeah, it's coming and he's destroying the town. And Thor is like, I'm going to stop this. I'll die to stop this. And I thought it was a very human depiction of the character. And it kind of, the reason I like one of these particular moments is for a similar reason, because it's when they had to go back in time and he's back in Asgard and he sees his mother and he knows she's going to die. And I just thought that was really beautifully written and that Chris Hemsworth handled it really, really, well. Before we move on to Jane Foster, how do you feel about Cap being able to pick up the hammer? Yes or no? Clay?
Yeah, because Cap is Cap. He occupies a unique space in the Marvel universe. He's Superman, even though he's not.
Yeah.
He is. The thing in the comics, though, I mean, I don't know what the count is now of the people who can lift Thor's hammer, but it's quite a few. The whole tie to worthiness, there are plenty of times when Thor's really not worthy and he's still wielding the hammer. So, I don't know, it's a little murky, but Cap is Cap and whatever Cap can do is okay with me.
Okay, Bobby?
And Cap was the first non-Asgardian to do it in the comics. And does it in a way kind of like in the movie. It was in the heat of battle.
Yeah.
It was one of those things. He didn't think, I'm going to go, I need the hammer. He's just like, I need a weapon. And he reaches out and grabs the first thing handy, which happens to be Mjolnir.
Yeah.
And so I don't have a problem with it. I got one of those, choked up moments when it happens in the movie.
Oh, yeah.
When the hammer flies back into Cap's hand. I was right there with Thor with the, I knew it, And so, so I thought it was a cool bit, and I thought it went on just long enough,
Yeah. Yes.
that, because he kind of loses it there at one point. And I thought it worked well. I thought it worked well with power, showing that he could still wield the power, use the lightning and all that. So yeah, it was really good.
Okay, Mike?
I have to agree. I liked it for what it was, even knowing that it was coming. I was still choked up when it happened. It was a great moment. And being in the movie theater when the whole crowd erupts when it happens, it was a moment that I won't forget. And like you said, it lasted long enough to be significant, but not too long that it got stale. I like that it was necessary. He did it because it was necessary, and he could do it because it was necessary. That, I believe, that's the strong point about why he could lift the hammer. It was necessary. He's the warrior that had to be able to do it to save the day.
And he didn't stop being Captain America.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Because he was still doing Captain America fight moves.
Yes.
And using the hammer and the shield together. And
right.
So it wasn't like he just, because, in the comics especially, if someone picks it up, they just become Thor. And everything else about him kind of goes away. I like the fact that it was still him. This is just another weapon.
I agree. Yeah, he wasn't wielding lightning and stuff, which I think was a step too far.
Yeah. Well, it's unanimous because that's what I think too. So we're all in agreement on this one thing. So Thor and Jane Foster, how do you think their relationship has evolved, and do you like it? Mike, you want to start?
I like that. I like that they made her the brains to his brawn. From the beginning of the movie, from the beginning of the trilogy, she was always the brains. Whenever they were together, she was the thinking one and he was the doer. And I love that dynamic for them. I love that she wasn't just a damsel in distress. She was a necessary piece of the narrative of the story. She was a necessary function of accomplishing the goal, whatever the goal was. Like I said, she was the brains that had to think about, the situations that they were in. I love that for her. And unfortunately, her not being that big of a character in the overall Marvel Cinematic Universe, she gets sidelined along with a lot of the other the main characters' love interests, which is kind of a shame because she is really, they made a version of Jane Foster that deserved to be upgraded, go back and be upgraded in the comics. So I'm glad that happened.
Okay, Clay?
Yeah, I agree with that. In the original Jane Foster, the nurse in the comics, she was a typical Marvel 60s kick. No big deal. She never did. They never allowed her to do much.
Yeah.
Except, the Cobra's out. I liked her.
He's so dreamy.
Yeah, some of that too. I liked her in the first two movies. I thought they missed an opportunity in the second movie, which I don't love, but I wish they had done more with her in Asgard.
Yes.
That seemed like a huge opportunity missed, sort of the fish out of water from her point of view, where they've done it with Thor. And let her meet the family a little bit more and sort of see the regular, hey, is the girlfriend from back on Earth meeting all the Asgardians, and maybe a troll gets loose or Ulik comes through or whatever. Would have been cool, but I think they blew that, frankly. And then, for whatever reason, she vanishes, whether it's the actress didn't want to do it. I don't know what the story is, or Thor mentions her every now and then. Oh, where's Jane? That's nice. It's good that you did that. But yeah, it lost its momentum, and they wrote her out for whether they had to or they just wanted to. The first two are pretty good. I like.
Okay, Bobby.
Yeah, because it seems like after the first two, like in the Avengers movie, it's like, oh, is she safe? You know, they spirited her away to be safe, and then in Ragnarok, it's just, oh, y'all broke, you know, they broke up, you know, because I remember the women on the street are going like, sorry to hear you guys broke, or she dumped you, and you know, and that's kind of, you know, that was kind of like this was before I knew she was going to come back in the fourth one. You know, I was kind of like, man, that's kind of a sad way for Jane to kind of be written out, because with her abilities, I mean, Eric is certainly a big part of the first Avengers movie, and she and he worked so closely together. You know, she could have equally been important to solving some of these problems.
Yes.
You know, but like you said, the reasons that she wasn't there, like I know some of it had to do with Natalie Portman not wanting to do it, but yeah. So, I think in terms of the comics, I'm glad that, you know, after a while, you know, she kind of falls out of the book for a while, and she's in and out of the book. That every time they didn't bring her back later, she's not like his girlfriend again. You know,
right?
You know, they have a different relationship now, because in the comics, she got the powers of a Valkyrie now.
Yes.
After she was Thor for a while, and so they have a relationship, but it's not, oh, they're back together, they got to be there's not a love interest thing anymore. It's and I like that. I as a writer, one of the things that gets me, and you guys probably do this too, it's like every time they have a man and woman in anything together, the first thing they feel like they got to do is pair them up.
Yes.
And that doesn't have to be every character.
No.
And so I like the fact that Thor and Jane can have that relationship. And even in the fourth movie, it's they didn't go back to that. You know, they kind of like, yeah, we had that, that's over.
Yeah.
Now we've got this. And, and I like that. That they didn't try to force them back into that boyfriend girlfriend mode or whatever.
Go ahead, Clay.
I'm going to ask Bobby a question, because I don't read current Thor, so I don't know what they've done with Jane. I mean, I know she became Thor for a while. As a Valkyrie, is she in the space that really Sif should be in? As the sort of brother in arms type character?
Kind of. I mean, yeah, she's on Earth. I mean, she's on Earth mostly.
Yeah.
But she has inhabited that Valkyrie role because most of them have been wiped out. And so she's kind of inhabited that. She is on Earth most of the time. Every once in a while, she gets involved with Asgardian stuff, but most of the time she's on Earth. Like I think she was an Avenger for a short period, and so
what's her name? Does she have?
She's Valkyrie. Valkyrie.
Oh, she's Valkyrie.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Right.
And so, and like they've changed a lot of stuff. There was a big crossover a couple years back that really altered a lot of characters. Like Heimdall dies. And so Sif now inhabits Heimdall's role. She is the one standing guard on the Rainbow Bridge. So that's kind of mostly all she does is she's, you know, there with the sword, you know. So yeah, and then Thor's back and forth between, you know,
That's a lousy job.
Yeah.
Well, what do you all think of Jane Foster as Thor?
It was fun.
The story. Yeah.
Yes. It was fun. It definitely was fun. It was fun. Speaking of a good fish out of water story, in the comic when she initially became Thor, she had this her Jane Foster inner voice had this completely different tone about it than she would speak as Thor, and I thought that was just so creative. I always thought it was hilarious that her inner voice just sounded like this regular everyday Jane Foster, trying to understand what just happened to her and how, you know, how to deal with these new powers. I thought the beginning of it was great. Yeah. I just love that. I just love that inner monologue that she had in the beginning.
Yeah. Well, and there was also too in the beginning of that series of stories, there was the mystery of who is
Yes.
the female Thor. They
Right,
did not
right,
come
yeah.
out and tell us.
They tell us, yes.
There were a lot of red herrings. It could be this one or this one. You know.
Yeah.
And so, and one of the things that when we do find out it's Jane, and they did this in the movie too, that, you know, Jane has cancer and she's, you know, taking the chemo. Every time she becomes Thor, it undoes all that.
Yeah.
So she's killing herself every time she's fine as Thor. She's healthy, no problem. Yeah. But when she turns back into Jane, it's undone all of the treatment.
Chemotherapy.
It's gone. Yeah. And so she's slowly but surely killing herself to do this stuff that she feels needs to be done.
Okay.
So, yeah, but I thought the story was really well done. I think it went on to, it's one of those things, you have a tendency you can have these things go too long.
Yeah, yeah.
And it wasn't long before Thor was back in the book as well.
Yeah.
I mean, she was there too, but he was also part of the story. And then, you know, eventually, you know, he becomes, you know, I mean, he was always Thor, but he gets Mjolnir back and all that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, well, we've actually blown through our time. But before we close out, is there anything that anybody wants to talk about before we wrap up?
Have we talked about Mangog?
Well,
you know,
somebody on the panel might have mentioned Mangog.
All right, then I'm good.
Okay. Well, then let's go around. Please tell people where they can find information about you and your work. And if you have something recent or upcoming that you want to specifically highlight, please do that. And Mike, we'll start with you.
All right. As usual, come out to the website, www.themarveluniverseonline.com, and check out our deck. And I am everywhere. You know, the project is everywhere. We're on Twitter, Facebook, all the new ones, Mastodon, Hive, that other one, Instagram. We're trying to expand out into, I told Nancy about it. We're trying to get something together for the project for YouTube. So we have a YouTube channel. I admittedly haven't done anything with it, but look for that in the future.
Okay. Clay?
You can find us at clayandsusangriffith.com. And we are both on Facebook under our names, both independently and separately. That's all. I mean, Susan, I think, is on Twitter. I'm not on Twitter now. And we're working on some things that we hope will be published this year, knock wood, but nothing that we can announce.
Okay. Bobby?
You can find me at bobbynash.com is my website. I'm author Bobby Nash on Facebook, at Bobby Nash on Twitter, Bobby Nash Writes on Instagram. I'm all over the place. I'm not hard to find. There's always stuff in the pipeline. My most recent release was, I don't know if you can see them behind me. They're kind of small. The first two books in a horror Western series I'm doing called Dante's Tenth and Dante's Showdown. Just came out a month or two ago. And so those were kind of, and I got to write a story. This was a kind of one of those dream gigs for me. I got to write a story for the Kolchak the Night Stalker 50th anniversary collection, which was, you know, an incredible thing for me. Yeah. And just to throw it out there, Marvel, if you're listening, I would love to write Thor, you know, and I wouldn't even screw up Mangog, you know, for Clay, you know, say that for him. So.
Okay. Well, you can find me here at ConTinual. My website is nancynorthcott.com. I'm on Twitter, probably more than is good for me, and I'm at Nancy Northcott. I have Nancy Northcott Author on Facebook, but I use that mostly so I can have my street team, which is Nancy Northcott Street Team, and I'm still building that. I've actually finally figured out Instagram, and I'm Nancy Northcott Author, but I just figured it out, so there's not much there. And my next release, as we're filming this, will launch the next weekend, which is the first weekend in May. It's The King's Champion. It's set during the summer of 1940 and the Battle of Britain. It's the conclusion to the Boar King's Honor historical fantasy trilogy from Falstaff Books. And I'm really excited. I've lived with those characters for a long time. So to see them come to the end of the road is kind of exciting for me. So thank you for being on the panel, everybody. And thank you to everyone who's watching. And thanks to our sponsors, Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and Heroes Convention. For more information about them, you can visit heroesonline.com.